By 1450, the population of northern Europe, which had declined due to the bubonic plague, was beginning to grow again. When the Hundred Years' War between France and England ended in 1453, many cities grew rapidly. Urban merchants became wealthy enough to sponsor artists. This happened first in Flanders, which was rich from long-distance trade and the cloth industry. Then, as wealth increased in other parts of northern Europe, patronage of the arts increased as well. While Italy had many large urban areas or cities, England and France were unified under strong monarchs. These rulers often sponsored the arts by purchasing paintings and by supporting artists and writers. Francis I of France invited Leonardo da Vinci to retire in France and hired Italian artists and architects to build and decorate his castle at Fontainebleau. The castle became a showcase for Italian Renaissance art. Albrecht Dürer traveled to Italy in 1494 to study the techniques of the Italian masters. Returning home, he employed these methods in painting and especially in engravings. In this form of art, an artist etches a design on a metal plate with acid. The artist then uses the plate to make prints. Many of Dürer's engravings portray the religious upheaval of his age. Through his art, as well as through essays, Dürer helped spread Italian Renaissance ideas to his homeland. Because of his wide-ranging interests, which extended far beyond art, he is sometimes called the German Leonardo. Hubert van Eyck used recently developed oil-based paints to develop techniques that painters still use today. By applying layer upon layer of paint, Van Eyck was able to create a variety of subtle colors in clothing and jewels. Oil painting became popular and spread to Italy. In addition to new techniques, Van Eyck's paintings display unusually realistic details and reveal the personality of their subjects. His work influenced later artists in Northern Europe. Italian humanists were very interested in reviving classical languages and classical texts. When the Italian humanist ideas reached the North, people used them to examine the traditional teachings of the Church. The Northern humanists were critical of the failure of the Christian Church to inspire people to live a Christian life. Thomas More tried to show a better model of society. In 1516, he wrote the book Utopia. In Greek, utopia means no place. The book is about an imaginary land where greed, corruption, and war have been weeded out. Everybody is educated and there is no homelessness or poor. In Utopia, because there is little greed, utopians had very little use for money. Today, the term utopia has come to mean an ideal place as depicted in More's book. A utopian world is a perfect world. A utopian future is the future without any of today's societal problems. The most famous writer of the age was William Shakespeare. Many people regard him as the greatest playwright of all time. From England, he wrote poems and plays, and soon he would be performing at the Globe Theatre. Like many Renaissance writers, Shakespeare revered the classics and drew upon them for inspiration and plots. His works display a masterful command of the English language and a deep understanding of human beings. He revealed the souls of men and women through scenes of dramatic conflict. Many of these plays examine the human flaws. Many historians have called the printing press one of the greatest inventions in the world. Johann Gutenberg, a craftsman from Germany, developed a printing press that incorporated a number of technologies in a new way. The process made it possible to produce books quickly and cheaply. The printing press enabled a printer to produce hundreds of copies of a single work. For the first time, books were cheap enough that many people could buy them. The first book Gutenberg made on his new printing press was the Bible. At first, printers produced many religious works, but soon they began to provide other subjects, such as travel guides and medical manuals. With books more readily available, more people learned to read. Readers gained access to the broad range of knowledge, from medicine and law to astrology. Printed books exposed educated Europeans to new ideas, expanding their horizons. As we will soon find out, the new presses would contribute to the Protestant Renaissance. Please stop this video now and watch the video on Schoology titled Gutenberg Press. In 1500, there were only two forms of Christianity that existed. Think about it. Today there are thousands. In 1500, there was Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. Which form of Christianity dominated Europe in 1500? It was easily Catholicism. By the 10th century, the Roman Catholic Church had come to dominate religious life in Northern and Western Europe. Pretty much Europe was Catholic. But over the centuries, many people criticized its practices. They felt that the church leaders were too interested in getting rich and gaining political power. Even though the church made some reforms during the Middle Ages, people continued to criticize it. In 1517, the church's domination over everyone in Europe would change, and it begins with this man. Martin Luther started what would be called the Protestant Reformation, or sometimes just the Reformation. Luther never actually set out to break up the Catholic Church, just to reform the church. Luther himself was a German monk and a professor of theology. As a young man, his father wanted him to become a lawyer, but Luther was interested in religion. He was nearly struck by lightning in a thunderstorm. He was terrified that it was God's way of punishing him, so he promised to become a monk. Luther prayed and fasted and tried to lead a holy life, but he soon grew disillusioned with what he saw as church corruption and worldliness. His actions caused a huge revolution in Europe and the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation was a reform movement that split the Catholic Church into a number of Protestant churches or religions. Please stop this video and watch Martin Luther video on Schoology. Luther wrote 95 theses or formal statements attacking the church. On October 31st, 1517, he posted these statements on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg and invited other scholars to debate him. Someone copied Luther's words and sent them to a printer. Quickly, Luther's name became known all over Germany. His actions began the Reformation, a movement for religious reform. It led the founding of the Christian churches that did not accept the Pope's authority. So what were some of these criticisms? First were the certificates of indulgences. Here's one on the right. It's written in Latin. The one on the left is a translation. It says, "By the authority of all saints, and in mercy towards you, I absolve you from all sins and misdeeds, and remit all punishments for 10 days." Indulgences were certificates issued by the church that were said to reduce or even cancel punishment for a person's sins. People purchased indulgences believing the documents would assure them admission to heaven. People were also encouraged to buy indulgences for salvation of their dead relatives. Indulgences could relieve them of guilt for future sins. With indulgences, you could have a sinful weekend, and if you had the money, purchase a certificate and you were sin-free. Better yet, you could buy them in advance. You knew you were going to have a really good sinning weekend, so you purchased an indulgence before the weekend so God could forgive you in advance. What a bargain! In addition, you may not know if your parents or friends or relatives who had died made it to heaven. Maybe they were stuck in purgatory. Well, good news. You could even purchase indulgences for them as well. Buy a certificate to give them that little extra bump they need to get into heaven. This was just one of Luther's criticisms. Another was justification of faith. In Christian theology, justification is God's act of removing all guilt and penalty of sin, while at the same time making a sinner righteous through Christ's atoning sacrifice. In Lutheranism and Calvinism, righteousness from God is viewed as being credited to the sinner's account through faith alone, without works. Some of Luther's teachings included justification of faith. His central teachings, that the Bible is the central source of religious authority and that salvation is reached through faith and not deeds, shaped the core of Protestantism. The Bible is the truth, not church leaders. All church teaching should be clearly based on the words of the Bible. Both the Pope and church traditions were false authorities. The Catholic Church only published the Bible in Latin. Latin was considered the holy religion of the church. The problem was that no one but the church leaders could read the Bible. The Bible could make up anything about Christian traditions, and the people wouldn't know. Luther stressed the importance of reading the Bible so people could see for themselves. Everyone in God's eyes were equal. Priests were not special. They were not closer to God, and they did not hold any special powers. When people went to church, they couldn't understand the Mass. It was performed only in Latin, not in the native language of the people. If you were in England, Mass wasn't in English. It was in Latin. And none of the churchgoers could understand what the priests were saying. Luther said that the Mass should be performed in the native language of the churchgoers. Please stop this video and watch the video on Schoology titled Luther's Teachings. Luther was surprised at how fast his ideas spread and attracted followers. Initially, church officials in Rome viewed Luther as just as a rebellious monk who needed to be punished by his superiors. However, as Luther's ideas became more popular, the Pope realized that this monk was a serious threat. The Pope ordered Luther to recant his views. Recant means to say that one no longer holds an opinion or belief, or to take back a belief, but Luther refused. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a decree threatening Luther with excommunication unless he took back his statements. Luther did not take back a word. Instead, his students at Wittenberg gathered around a bonfire and cheered as he threw the Pope's decree into the flames. Leo excommunicated Luther. Excommunicate means to break off from the church, and back then it was meaning to cut off from society. The Edict of Worms was issued. It declared Luther an outlaw and a heretic. According to this edict, no one in the empire was to give Luther food or shelter. All of his books were to be burned. However, one prince disobeyed the edict. Almost a year he sheltered Luther in one of his castles, and while there, Luther translated the New Testament into German. Luther returned to Wittenberg in 1522. There he discovered that many of his ideas were already being put into practice. Instead of continuing to seek reforms in the Catholic Church, Luther and his followers became a separate religious group called Lutherans. In the end, most of Northern Europe, which included Germany, the Netherlands, and England, became Protestants, while Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, remained Catholic. Another reformer, John Calvin, presented more challenges to the Catholic Church. Calvin was a very intelligent and logical person. He had been trained as a lawyer. His ideas had a huge effect on the direction of the Reformation. Calvin published a book called The Institute of Christian Religion. In this book, which was read by Protestants everywhere, he set forth his religious beliefs. In his book, he preached predestination, the idea that God had long ago determined who would gain salvation. To Calvinists, the world was divided into two kinds of people, saints and sinners. Calvinists tried to live like saints, believing that only those who were saved could truly lead religious Christian lives. In 1514, Calvin set up a theocracy in Geneva, Switzerland. A theocracy is a government run by church leaders. Calvin's followers in Geneva saw themselves as a new chosen people entrusted by God to build a truly Christian society. Calvinists stressed hard work, discipline, thrift, honesty, and morality. If you lived in this newfound theocracy, you would be fined or punished for offenses such as fighting, swearing, laughing in church, or dancing. Calvin closed theaters and disliked fancy clothes. To many Protestants, this emphasis on strict morality made Calvinist Geneva seem like a model community. A Scottish preacher named John Knox brought Calvinism to Scotland in a form called Presbyterianism. In France, Calvin's followers were called Huguenots. Hatred between Catholics and Huguenots led to violence. The most violent clash occurred in Paris on August 24, 1572. At dawn, Catholic mobs began hunting for Protestants and murdering them. The massacre spread to other cities and lasted 6 months. Historians believe that as many as 12,000 Huguenots were killed. In England, there were also criticisms of the Catholic Church. However, it wouldn't be Calvin or Luther or the people who would demand change. It would be the King of England, King Henry VIII. At first, Henry VIII was against the Protestant revolt. The Pope even awarded him the title Defender of the Faith for something Henry wrote denouncing Luther. But in 1527, Henry became angry with the church. After 18 years of marriage, Henry and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, only had one child, Mary Tudor. Henry wanted a son to inherit his throne. So Henry wanted to marry Anne Boleyn in hopes that they would have a son. Because Catholic law does not permit divorce, he asked the Pope to annul or cancel his marriage to Catherine. The Pope refused. So he separated the English church from the Catholic church and made himself the head of the English church. Henry then wed Anne Boleyn, who bore him a second daughter, Elizabeth. In the years ahead, Henry married 4 more times, but only had one son, Edward. After Henry VIII died, his children all had short reigns at the throne. But when Henry's daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary Tudor, took the throne in 1553, the country developed into a turmoil. She was a Catholic who returned the English Church to the rule of the Pope. People rebelled against her, and she had so many Protestants executed that she was named Bloody Mary. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, inherited the throne. Elizabeth I was determined to return her kingdom to Protestantism. In 1559, her government set up the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, with Elizabeth as its head. This was to be the only legal church in England. Elizabeth decided to establish a state church that moderate Catholics and moderate Protestants might both accept. To please the Protestants, priests in the Church of England were allowed to marry, and priests could deliver sermons in English, not Latin. To please the Catholics, the Church of England kept some of the trappings of the Catholic church service, such as the rich robes. Church services were revised to be somewhat more acceptable for Catholics. This story was told in a movie back in 1998 called Elizabeth. Stop this video and watch the video for the trailer of the movie Elizabeth on Schoology.